There's a thin veil between the world we perceive and the darkness that lies just beyond our reach. Most people spend their lives believing that logic and reason govern every corner of existence. But there are moments when the rules of physics seem to buckle under the weight of something ancient. These are the stories of the people who looked into the abyss and saw something looking back. Before we begin, you must understand that the following accounts are not merely fiction. They are the chilling recollections of those who survived the unexplainable. Sit back and ensure the doors are locked tight around you. Listen closely to the silence that follows each word. Sometimes the most terrifying thing about a ghost story is finding out it is true. We start tonight with a witness who learned that even your own bedroom is not a sanctuary. Imagine waking up in the dead of night to a silence so heavy it hurts your ears. You feel a presence in the corner, a density in the air that shouldn't be there. You try to scream, but your voice is swallowed by the shadows. This is only the beginning of a journey into the heart of the unknown. Each story tonight has been verified by those who lived through them. They defy explanation, and they challenge everything we think we know about reality. From the woods that eat sounds to the objects that carry a curse. We are diving deep into the accounts that keep investigators up at night. Do not assume you're safe just because you're indoors. The spirits of the past often linger in the places we call home. They watch us from the mirrors and wait for us in the halls. Our first story comes from a woman named Sarah, who lived in a house with a secret. She didn't believe in ghosts until the day the shadows began to move on their own. This is just one of many testimonies that will challenge your perception of the world. There are places on this earth where the laws of nature simply do not apply. And there are entities that do not belong to our time or space. To hear these stories is to open a door that can never be shut. I advise you to listen with caution, as the mind has a way of making these horrors real. The static on your screen might be more than just interference. The wind outside might be carrying a message you're not ready to hear. We have gathered these accounts from across the globe, from cities to the deepest wilderness. Each one share a common thread, the encounter with the impossible. From the boy who saw his own double in the mirror, to the hikers who found a staircase in the middle of nowhere. These phenomena do not ask for our permission to manifest. They simply are, and they are more common than you think. Prepare your mind for the unsettling truth that awaits. The stories are ready, but are you ready to hear them? Once you know, you can never unknow. As the first story begins, notice the shadow in the corner of your own room. Has it always been that shape? Your eyes may play tricks on you, but the mind remembers the exact weight of a presence that shouldn't exist. In the summer of 1994, my bedroom was my only sanctuary from the world outside. I remember the smell of old comic books and the hum of a plastic fan oscillating on my desk. That night, the air felt inexplicably heavy, like the atmosphere before a violent thunderstorm. I glanced toward my closet, expecting to see the usual pile of laundry or my hanging coat. Instead, I noticed a patch of darkness that seemed far denser than the rest of the room. My heart skipped a beat as the shape began to bleed outward from the wood frame. It didn't have a face, yet I felt a gaze so cold it felt like ice pressing against my skin. I tried to scream for my parents, but my throat felt as though it had been filled with sand. The figure stood over 7 feet tall, its head nearly brushing the popcorn ceiling. It didn't move like a human, it shimmered like heat rising off a desert highway. Then, the thing began to lean forward, tilting at an angle that should have been impossible. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that when I opened them, the nightmare would be gone. I could hear a sound like dry autumn leaves skittering across a sidewalk. When I finally dared to peek, the figure was inches away from my face. I felt a sudden drop in temperature that turned my breath into a white mist. It reached out a long, spindly arm, its fingers tapering into sharp points of nothingness. The moment its finger touched my brow, a wave of memories that weren't mine flooded my mind. I saw flashes of old houses, gray skies, and a faceless woman weeping in a cellar. I lashed out blindly, my hand passing right through the entity as if it were smoke. The figure recoiled, its form dissolving into a swarm of black particles that vanished into the air. Suddenly, the weight on my chest lifted, and I was able to draw a ragged breath. I sprinted to the light switch and flooded the room with a blinding yellowish glow. The room was empty, every toy and book exactly where I had left them. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw 3 distinct black soot marks on my forehead. I scrubbed until my skin was raw, but the marks felt like they were burned into my very soul. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, sitting with my back against the locked door. My parents told me it was just a night terror, a byproduct of an overactive imagination. But I knew what I had felt, and I knew that the darkness had weight. The second night was worse, as the figure didn't wait for me to fall asleep. It stood in the center of the room, pointing toward the floor beneath my bed. Trembling, I leaned over the edge and peered into the abyss under the mattress. There, tucked into a corner of the baseboard, was a small, rusted iron key. I had lived in this house for 5 years and had never seen that key before. As soon as my fingers closed around the metal, the shadow figure let out a sound like a dying sigh. It vanished instantly, leaving behind a smell of ozone and wet earth. I never found the lock that the key belonged to, no matter how hard I searched. Even now, as an adult, I carry that key in my pocket as a reminder of what I saw. Some things are better left locked away, but sometimes the lock is already broken. Just as I thought the shadow had left for good, I noticed my bedroom door beginning to creak open on its own. Out in that hallway, the air began to ripple, as if the very fabric of reality was starting to tear apart. I watched as the shimmering distortion in the hallway air grew until it consumed my entire field of vision. When the air finally settled, the shadow figure was gone, but the silence that followed was even more deafening. I decided to turn back toward the lobby, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud against the industrial carpet. I passed the same red fire extinguisher on the wall that I had noticed 5 minutes ago. Thinking nothing of it, I continued walking, expecting to see the double doors of the elevator bay any second. Instead, I rounded a corner only to see that same red fire extinguisher again. A cold sweat broke out across my neck as I realized the scratch on the glass was identical to the one before. I began to run, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every 50 feet, the same flickering light and the same fire extinguisher mocked my attempt to escape. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning my forehead against the cool, unresponsive drywall. I looked down at my watch and saw that the second hand was vibrating in place, unable to tick forward. Time itself seemed to have fractured, leaving me caught in a single, repeating moment. I screamed for help, but the sound didn't travel. It felt like the air was swallowing my voice. I slumped to the floor, the weight of the impossible situation pressing down on my shoulders. Suddenly, the lights all hummed in a low, resonant frequency that vibrated in my teeth. I looked down the hall and saw a figure in the distance walking toward me. "Hey!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet as the person approached. As the figure got closer, I realized with a jolt of terror that it was wearing my own clothes. It wasn't just my clothes. The person walking toward me was an exact duplicate of myself. The other me moved with a jerky, stop-motion gait that made my skin crawl. I turned and fled again, but this time the hallway was changing behind me. I burst through a door I hadn't seen before, hoping for an exit to the street. I found myself back in the exact same hallway, staring at the same red fire extinguisher. My legs felt like lead, and my mind was beginning to fracture under the weight of the paradox. I heard the sound of a door opening somewhere far ahead of me. A janitor stepped out into the hall, whistling a tune that sounded like static. I tried to run to him, but the floor felt like it was moving in the opposite direction. "Wait!" I yelled, but the janitor didn't even look in my direction. As he turned his head, I saw that where his face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless surface. I tripped over my own feet and tumbled onto the ground, the carpet feeling like wet sandpaper against my palms. The janitor and his bucket vanished in a burst of digital noise, leaving me alone once more. I realized then that I wasn't in a real building anymore, but some kind of simulation error. I decided to stop fighting the loop and instead looked for the seams in the reality around me. In the corner of a door frame, I saw a flickering gap of absolute blackness. I reached my hand toward the void, feeling a coldness that seemed to freeze my very soul. If the loop wouldn't let me leave through the doors, I would go through the break in the world. I pressed my fingers into the gap and felt the reality around me start to crumble like dry plaster. A roar of white noise filled my head as the entire corridor began to dissolve into static. I reached out one last time, hoping to grab onto something solid before I was lost forever. But instead of an exit, I felt a rhythmic, heavy thumping coming from the other side of the void, like the heartbeat of a giant creature. The rhythmic thumping from the hallway void finally faded, replaced by the suffocating silence of the deep woods. I had traveled miles away from the city to find peace, but the air here felt heavy and wrong. My campfire crackled, yet the sound seemed muffled as if the forest was absorbing the noise. Suddenly, a sound drifted through the trees that didn't belong to any animal I knew. It was a series of rhythmic, clicking pops followed by a low, vibrating hum. I stood up, gripping my flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white. The clicking sound moved from my left to my right with impossible speed. Then the sound changed into something that resembled a human voice trying to speak underwater. It whispered my own name, but the vowels were stretched and the pitch was mechanically flat. I threw more wood on the fire, desperate for the protection of light. As the flames leaped higher, I saw a tall, spindly shadow retreat behind an oak tree. Every time I blinked, the vocalizations seemed to get closer and louder. I shouted into the darkness, demanding to know who was there. The forest responded by mimicking my exact shout with a 5-second delay, but the mimicry had a metallic screech underlying the tone. I realized I wasn't dealing with a person, but something that was learning how to sound like one. My phone had no signal, the screen glowing like a useless beacon. The vocalizations shifted into a rhythmic chant that vibrated in my chest. I scrambled into my tent and zipped the flap shut, though I knew thin nylon offered no real protection. Outside, the sound of heavy footsteps began to circle my camp. A long, thin finger traced the outline of the tent from the outside. The voice now sounded like it was right next to my ear, despite the physical barrier. It began reciting the very thoughts I was having in a mocking tone. "Don't look outside," it whispered with a gravelly, non-human resonance. I grabbed my hatchet, ready to swing at whatever entered. The circling stopped, and a heavy silence returned to the woods. I waited for hours, listening to the pounding of my own heart. As dawn approached, the first bird chirped, and the tension seemed to break. I unzipped the tent slowly, expecting to see the creature waiting for me. The clearing was empty, but the ground around my tent was covered in strange three-toed tracks. These tracks didn't lead into the forest. They simply stopped at the edge of my campsite. I packed my gear in record time, not even bothering to put out the smoldering fire properly. As I hiked back to my car, the feeling of being watched never left my spine. A snapping branch behind me sent me into a full sprint. I reached my truck and fumbled with the keys, the metal cold against my sweaty palms. I threw myself into the driver's seat and locked the doors immediately. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a smudge of dirt on my forehead that looked like a fingerprint. It was the same long, thin shape that had traced my tent. I started the engine, but the radio didn't play music. It played the clicking sounds from the woods. As I sped away, I looked back to see a tall, pale figure standing in the middle of the road holding a family heirloom I had left behind. I drove for 3 hours straight without looking in the rearview mirror a second time. When I finally reached my apartment, the silence of the hallway felt like a physical weight. I stepped inside and immediately noticed a strange metallic scent lingering in the air. My eyes were drawn to the wooden dining table sitting in the center of the room. There, resting perfectly in the center, was the silver locket I had abandoned in the forest. I knew for a fact I had seen it in the hands of that pale figure on the road. A wave of unnatural cold washed over me, causing my breath to mist in the air. I reached out a finger to touch the metal, wondering if I was simply hallucinating. The moment my skin grazed the silver, a sharp jolt of ice-cold energy shot up my arm. The locket didn't just feel cold, it felt alive, like a dormant heart beginning to beat. I watched in frozen silence as the fine silver chain began to slither across the wood like a snake. I grabbed a heavy glass bowl and slammed it down over the object to trap it. For several minutes I just stood there watching the glass vibrate against the table. My mind was screaming for an explanation that laws of physics couldn't provide. From beneath the glass, a faint rhythmic tapping began to echo through the apartment. It sounded like a fingernail clicking against a window pane, steady and deliberate. I tried to drown out the noise by turning on every light in the house. But the bulbs only hummed and flickered, refusing to provide a steady glow. I retreated to my bedroom and pushed the heavy dresser against the door. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching a kitchen knife I had grabbed in my panic. Hours passed as I listened to the tapping sound slowly move from the kitchen to the hallway. The sound changed from a metallic tap to the soft, wet sliding of something dragging itself. It stopped right outside the door, the scratching noise now coming from the wood itself. I realized the locket wasn't just a cursed object, it was a beacon for something much worse. I decided I had to destroy it, no matter the cost to my sanity. I shoved the furniture aside and threw the door open, expecting a monster. The hallway was empty, but the silver locket was sitting right at my feet. It was covered in a black, viscous slime that pulsed with a dull red light. I grabbed a heavy hammer from my toolbox and carried the locket out to the balcony. I placed the locket on the concrete railing and raised the hammer high above my head. As I swung down, a deafening screech tore through the night, but it didn't come from the locket. The hammer shattered against the concrete, leaving the locket completely unharmed. I looked at the locket and saw that the engravings had changed into a distorted map of my apartment. A small, ruby-colored dot was moving on the map, currently positioned right where I stood. Then a second dot appeared at the front door of the apartment on the map. I heard the sound of my heavy front door clicking unlocked from the inside. I fumbled with the balcony door, but the lock refused to budge, trapping me outside. Through the glass, I saw a tall, distorted shadow slowly emerge from my own bedroom. I began screaming for help, but my voice was swallowed by a sudden, unnatural silence. Just as the shadow reached the balcony door, my phone in my pocket began to vibrate with a call from my own number. I stared down at the vibrating device in my hand as the screen displayed my own contact name. My thumb hovered over the decline button while the logic of the situation failed to register. How could I be calling myself when the only phone I owned was right here in my palm? The ringing stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that felt heavy and suffocating. I immediately opened my call logs to see if this was some elaborate prank or a network error. There was no record of the incoming call, as if the last 30 seconds had never happened. I tossed the phone onto the sofa and tried to convince myself it was just a hallucination from exhaustion. Just as I turned toward the kitchen, the familiar chime of a new voicemail echoed through the room. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slowly walked back to the discarded device. I pressed the play button on the voicemail, expecting static or a telemarketer's recording. Instead, a raspy, rhythmic breathing filled the air, sounding far too close for a recording. Beneath the breath, I heard a faint, melodic whistling that I recognized instantly. It was the specific tune my grandfather used to whistle while working in his basement woodshop. But my grandfather had passed away over 3 years ago, and his phone line was disconnected. Driven by a morbid need for answers, I decided to call the old number back. The phone rang once, then twice, each tone vibrating through my very bones. A click signified the line had been picked up on the other end. There was no greeting, only the sound of a distant howling wind. "Grandpa?" I whispered into the receiver, my voice cracking with suppressed emotion. A voice that sounded like grinding stones replied with a single muffled word: "Watch." The line went dead immediately after, leaving me shivering in the center of the room. I looked around the apartment, searching for whatever the voice had commanded me to see. Everything seemed normal until my eyes landed on the old rotary phone my grandfather had gifted me. It wasn't even plugged into the wall, yet the dial began to rotate on its own. The numbers being dialed matched the date of his funeral exactly. Suddenly, every electronic device in the room began to hum with a low-frequency vibration. My television screen flickered to life, showing nothing but gray, dancing static. Within the static, a silhouette of a man sitting in a chair slowly began to form. I couldn't move as the figure on the screen turned its head to look directly at me. The smartphone in my hand began to heat up until it was almost painful to hold. I dropped the device, and upon hitting the floor, it shattered into a dozen pieces. From the broken remains, a black ink-like liquid began to seep out across the wood. I backed away, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the liquid formed letters. The fluid spelled out a single name that I hadn't heard in years. Elias was the name of the man my grandfather had always warned me never to mention. The lights in the apartment suddenly failed, plunging everything into total darkness. In the silence, I heard the heavy, slow footsteps of someone walking down the hall toward me. Each step was accompanied by the mechanical clicking of a rotary phone dial. I reached for the light switch, but my fingers met something cold and metallic instead. A spark of static electricity illuminated the room for a split second, revealing a tall figure standing inches from my face. Just as the darkness returned, the broken phone on the floor began to ring again with a deafening volume. The ringing from the previous house still echoed in my ears as I moved into the Victorian on Miller Street. At first, the sounds were nothing more than the natural settling of century-old timber. I would sit in the living room and hear a soft scratching behind the floral patterns of the wallpaper. I chalked it up to rodents or perhaps the wind whistling through the crawlspaces. Then, during the second week, the scratching transformed into a distinct rhythmic hum. It sounded like a dozen voices were trapped inside the lath and plaster, vibrating at the same frequency. I heard a woman's voice clearly say the name Eleanor right next to my left ear. There was no one else in the house, and the windows were all locked tight. I began to research the history of the property at the local library. I discovered that an Eleanor Vance had passed away in the very bedroom I occupied in 1924. Returning home that night felt like walking into the mouth of a predator. Every shadow seemed to have a weight and a purpose I couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder, now coming from the floorboards beneath my feet. Arthur, a deep, gravelly voice intoned from the basement door. I realized Arthur was the name of the man who had built the house and died in the cellar. I tried to play loud music to drown out the spectral roll call. But the music would fade into the background and the whispers would cut right through the melody. I felt the house itself was watching me, judging my presence in its corridors. One night I saw the wallpaper bulging out as if a hand were trying to push through from the other side. I spent 3 nights in a row awake, staring at that spot with a kitchen knife in my hand. The names being whispered weren't just the dead, they started whispering my name too. It was a soft, sibilant sound that seemed to come from the very air I breathed. I decided I had to leave, but the front door wouldn't budge when I turned the key. The wood of the frame seemed to have swollen instantly, sealing me inside. I ran to the windows, but the glass was cold as ice and wouldn't break even when I hit it with a chair. I was a prisoner in a house that wanted to digest me. That's when the walls began to bleed, a dark, viscous fluid that smelled of old copper. It wasn't blood exactly, but it felt like the life force of the house was leaking out. I retreated to the attic, hoping the height would offer some safety. In the corner of the attic, I saw a figure huddled under a moth-eaten blanket. I whispered Eleanor into the darkness, my voice trembling. The blanket fell away to reveal nothing but a pile of old, whispering books. The pages were turning themselves, the rustle of paper mimicking human speech. I realized the voices weren't coming from the walls, but from the memories the house had stored. Suddenly, the attic floor began to tilt as if the whole house were leaning over. I grabbed a support beam, my knuckles white with the effort of holding on. Downstairs, I heard the heavy front door finally swing open with a thunderous crash. I didn't wait to see why it had opened. I scrambled down and ran for my life. I left everything behind, my clothes, my furniture, and my peace of mind. But as I walked away, I felt a cold hand brush against my neck, and a voice whispered a new name I didn't recognize. I fled that house of whispering walls, leaving the unknown name echoing behind me. The engine groaned before finally roaring to life, offering a mechanical shield against the dark. I drove away as fast as the gravel path allowed, never looking at the rearview mirror. Soon I reached Highway 17, a stretch of asphalt that felt like a desert under the stars. My eyes were heavy, burning from the stress of the night's earlier terrors. Just as I was settling into the rhythm of the road, a pale figure appeared in my peripheral vision. She was standing there alone, miles from the nearest town or gas station. Against my better judgment, the instinct to help someone in the middle of nowhere took over. I pulled over to the shoulder, the tires crunching over dry glass and gravel. She didn't move an inch as I rolled down the passenger window. Her dress was white, but it seemed to shimmer with a damp, unnatural gray light. I asked if she needed a ride, my voice sounding thin and brittle in the cold air. Without a word, she opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. A sudden, freezing draft filled the cabin, making my breath fog up instantly. She didn't look at me, but stared straight ahead with eyes that seemed to lack pupils. I pulled back onto the road, feeling an overwhelming urge to get her to her destination quickly. I asked where she was headed, but the silence she returned was heavier than sound. I noticed that the radio had cut to static, a low-frequency hum vibrating through the floor. In the reflection of the window, I thought I saw her face distort into something much older. Suddenly, she pointed a long, thin finger at a turnoff that wasn't on any map I knew. The road she wanted was narrow, choked by twisting vines and low-hanging branches. I felt like I was driving into the mouth of a giant beast, the air growing thick with the scent of wet earth. She turned her head toward me, and I realized her mouth was sewn shut with black thread. I slammed on the brakes, but the car didn't stop. It just glided over the ground like it was floating. I tried to open my door, but the handle felt like ice and wouldn't budge. She reached out a hand toward my face, her touch feeling like 1,000 needles of frost. I closed my eyes and screamed, praying for any escape from this nightmare. There was a loud bang, and the sound of breaking glass filled my ears. When I opened my eyes, the car was parked safely back on the shoulder of Highway 17. The passenger seat was empty, and there was no sign of the woman ever being there, except for a single wet piece of thread resting on the seat cover. I looked at the clock, and I had lost 4 hours in what felt like 5 minutes. I drove the rest of the way home in total silence, never once looking back. These 9 stories remind us that the world we think we know is just a thin veil. Behind that veil lie shadows that watch, voices that call, and paths that lead nowhere. We may never explain the unexplainable, but we must acknowledge it exists in the corners of our lives. Next time you're alone and feel a sudden chill, do not assume it is just the wind. It might be a reminder that some things are better left unknown and unsearched. Stay safe, keep your lights on, and always watch the road ahead. Sleep well if you can, for the shadows are always waiting for the sun to set again.